Let's break the political talk show mold. Anything worth doing is hard, and that includes being a good citizen. Our mission is to help you be that better citizen by letting you hear about stuff you might not know, which will make everyone think you're so smart, or by giving you a chance to listen to interviews and debates on a wide variety of subjects that might actually allow you to form new opinions in the privacy of your own mind. I'm Justin Oldham, and you are listening to the Politics and Patriotism Show here on the Stitcher Smart Radio Network.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world. You're listening to another Politics and Patriotism podcast with me, Martin Bain. Justin is around, but he's going to be doing probably some of the back studio work. Today, we are talking with author Toby Harden, who has written Dead Men Risen, The Welsh Guards and the Real Story of Britain's War in Afghanistan. I've got to say, first of all, I've read the book, and that's the reason why we wanted to talk to you, and sort of get your perspective and your background, and maybe some of the views that I get the impression are in the book. So thank you very much and welcome to the show.
Sure, good to be here.
And sort of the book, to me, I read it in a very quick time. I sort of was up till the wee small hours on certainly 2 or 3 days reading the book, and it's to me, my view straight away is it's a damning indictment of failure of politicians and senior military leaders to support our soldiers in Afghanistan. Now, was that your intention when you wrote the book, or was your intention just to tell the story of the Welsh Guards in Afghanistan and the sort of the tragic loss of many soldiers and particularly their commanding officer?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, right at the outset, I guess my intention was just to tell the story. And when I first flew out to Helmand towards the end of the Welsh Guards tour, I mean, all I knew really was that Lieutenant Colonel Rupert Thorne had been killed, and Major Sean Birchall, company commander, had been killed, and so had Lieutenant Mark Everson, a platoon commander, and other people. And I sort of I sort of sensed that there was going to be, a very compelling story in there, but I didn't completely know what it was. And it was only, in terms of how long it took me to write, I mean, the process of writing was probably approaching 18 months or so. And during that period, when I got back from Helmand, I sort of had one picture. I'd been out there for a few weeks. I'd spoken to people, lots of people, and I'd sort of seen for myself what was going on. But it was only really after this, over the course of the next year plus, that various sort of strands began to unfold. I got access to a very large number of documents, which provided quite a few missing pieces from the puzzle. And I do think, in fact, I remember saying to the publisher sort of shortly before submitting the manuscript that, I think this has actually turned out to be a book about what happens when you under-resource a war. So I think, the indictment of senior military officers and politicians certainly ended up being, a very sort of key element of the book.
And I think for those who haven't read the book, it's a fairly harrowing and in some cases fairly brutal account of operations in Afghanistan, and certainly the loss of so many soldiers, and I think what has happened a little bit is I think some people have maybe more focused on the loss of the very senior officers here, but I think your book has brought across that the loss and injury of any soldier in war is an absolute tragedy. But I think there has been a focus on the fact that, some very senior commanders have been lost operational. And I think it does show in all levels of the British Army that from the lowest private to the most senior officer, that they're all prepared to take point duty. And the commanding officer was killed when he was doing mine-sweeping operations in front of a convoy, which I think is a testament to not only the Welsh Guards, but to the way that the British military ingrained the philosophy that, you can't lead from behind, you have to lead from the front. But one of the interesting things I get from your book is there seemed to have been some kind of arrogance and complacency from very senior military commanders who were almost trying to keep up with the Americans by saying, we can do this operation and we don't need 15, 20,000 men to do this operation. We can do it with considerably less. Now, is that a fair assessment of what you saw and what you gathered in writing the book?
I'm Luke Herbert, and this program is supported by 3feetradio.com.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think undoubtedly the British, I guess both as a nation, if you like, and as an army, or as military more broadly, bit off more than they could chew. I think it was a case of, yes, keeping up with the Americans was a key part. I think within the army, certainly, there was a feeling that Basra and Iraq had been somewhat of a disappointment, or if not, arguably a defeat, and certainly a lot of criticism from the American military about British operations there. And I think from Tony Blair, sort of politically, felt that Afghanistan, which turned out to be Helmand, was a way of kind of erasing the stain of Iraq politically. And I think the army also saw an opportunity to sort of put Iraq behind them and do something that was sort of achievable and something that showed the Americans what the British could do. But very small numbers, I think 3,000 or so troops that went in to Helmand in around the start of 2006, and I was out there just before that first deployment. I mean, clearly, and it was said at the time, clearly that wasn't enough. And then fast forward to 2009, shortly after the Welsh Guards left, you had about 10,000 British troops and more than 20,000 US Marines as well, so a total of 30,000 troops. And there was a very interesting point made by Lieutenant Colonel Charlie Antelm, who was Rupert Thornlow's successor after Thornlow was killed. Antelm was blown out to replace him, and he said, look at the way the Australians do things. The Australians, they always choose something that's fairly small, and they do it really, really well. And then after that, people say, the Australians did a really good job. Maybe we could do a little bit more. And his feeling was that the British, by contrast, were always sort of trying to punch above their weight and always trying to say, no, we can do it. We can do more with less. And I think if you look at what happened in Helmand certainly up until 2009, overstretched, under-resourced, and therefore not achieving the mission, which apart from the obviously the tragic loss of life involved in that politically and militarily, is probably not a good thing for the UK.
And I think that absolutely comes out in the book. And for those who haven't read the book, the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Rupert Thornlow, was killed by a improvised explosive device, or IED, and he had made the very conscious decision that he was going to be out in the front of the convoy searching for these mines. And I guess one of the other things that comes across in your book is sort of lack of equipment, and the fact that I suspect, looking and reading between the lines in your book, that low metal content improvised electronic devices were probably fairly well known across Afghanistan. But again, there seems to have been, if I read the book and understand it, abject failure outside of Afghanistan, and also absolute political incompetence. And I'm going to say those words, and if you want to disagree with me, please do so, but absolute political incompetence from Tony Blair and Gordon Brown to ensure that our forces had the right equipment.
Yeah, I mean, it's very complicated in terms of exactly what happened and why the procurement system was sort of so slow and so inadequate. And you speak to whoever you speak to, they'll always blame someone else. And I certainly got a lot of that from the Ministry of Defence and to some extent politically and diplomatically as well. But the bottom line is, with the Welsh Guards out there, and this was amply demonstrated in Rupert Thornlow's the documents he wrote, the weekly reports and sometimes the daily reports that would go from the battalion battle group level, his level, up to the brigade. I mean, he was almost literally sort of tearing his hair out at lack of manpower and the sort of shifting mission. Like he was very, very sceptical about Panther's Claw, which was the big sort of sweeping operation to take new ground. He was very, very concerned about the inadequacy of the armour on many of the vehicles he was using. I mean, during the tour, the Mastiff vehicle, which, as far as I know, even up till now, no one's actually been killed inside. That they were coming out, but the Welsh Guards and the rest of the battle group had to use Vikings, which are amphibious, sort of all-terrain vehicles, and also Jackal, sort of light desert patrol vehicles, which offered virtually no protection against IEDs. And additionally, it wasn't just the vehicles; it was the actual equipment that was available to detect IEDs. And as you correctly mentioned, low metal content IEDs were a huge worry at this time. I mean, there was a real sort of exponential increase in the use of these devices with very little metal or virtually no metal in some cases in them, which meant, obviously by definition, a metal detector couldn't detect them. So you had these soldiers going out with it's called Operation Farmer, which is the name for walking along with a metal detector. It was a Vallon metal detector looking for IDs. And I remember one soldier saying to me, it's about as much, might as well be doing this with a golf club, because you're using a metal detector for looking for something that may not have metal in it. Absolutely terrifying. And I mean, the thing about Rupert Thornlow is, as I said, his concerns were the nature of the mission, and in particular Operation Panther's Claw, the inadequacy of the armour on the vehicles, and the threat of low metal content IEDs. And on July the 1st, 2009, when he was killed on Operation Panther's Claw, leading from the front in a Viking vehicle which was not adequately protected by a low metal content IED on that canal track. So almost eerie sort of confluence of those three elements that he had been very concerned about and very, very animated in arguing with the brigade about, all came together in his death, and absolutely tragic, both in itself and tragic that the very things that he was drawing attention to resulted in his death.
And one of the other things that I also read or got the gist of in the book was that many convoys had to take place because, yet again, our military and political leaders didn't understand how many Chinooks and helicopters we needed, and there was almost a rationing of the helicopters to casualty evacuation rather than using them like the Americans do, using their Black Hawks, using their Chinooks and their other helicopter fleet to actually move troops around. We have so few of these that I suppose if they're rationed, you almost have to turn around and say my priority is going to be casualty evacuation and recovery.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the number of helicopters, again, this was a thing that Rupert Thornlow was arguing about with the brigade consistently, and the brigades, to give them their due, were also arguing with at divisional level, the regional command south level, operating out of Kandahar. But yeah, I mean, basically during Operation Panther's Claw, the Welsh Guards were not the main effort. The Light Dragoons were the main effort, which meant that they were even more starved than usual of helicopters, and so there was no possibility of helicopters inserting the Welsh Guards on the Shamlan Canal. They basically had to walk up it, and yeah, I mean, apart from fast air if they were under attack, I mean, helicopters were available principally for Kazovac. And there's one absolutely harrowing passage in the book. And incidentally, you mentioned the fact that the book is pretty gruesome in parts, and that certainly is the case. And I thought long and hard about this, and my sort of decision was that I didn't want to airbrush what happened, and I didn't want to sort of sanitize what war is like. So, war in all its sort of bloody horror is pretty much there. I mean, there were some details, I didn't want to be gratuitous about it, that were left out, but basically, I mean, the sort of sickening reality of it is apparent. And when, after Rupert Thornlow was killed, along with Trooper Joshua Hammond of the Royal Tank Regiment on July the 1st, 2009, the bodies were evacuated back to Camp Bastion. But, as every soldier who's been out there knows, when a vehicle is hit by an ID and people are killed, it's very messy indeed. And there were body parts that were left in the Viking vehicle, just as an illustration of the lack of helicopters. The decision was taken that there weren't enough helicopters, and it was too dangerous for them to fly onto the Shamlan Canal to remove the body parts. So you had Welsh Guards officers actually who took charge of body parts in the sort of searing heat in Afghanistan in August for 3 days before vehicles were able to get up there and take those body parts. So, a tremendously harrowing process for the Welsh Guards out there, and harrowing for the families too. And certainly there was a feeling amongst some of the Welsh Guards that was, almost beyond the pale in terms of not having enough equipment to perform a very basic, almost kind of humanitarian task of removing parts of the bodies of the fallen.
And one of the things that interests me is reading the book and then looking at what happened afterwards. I don't see that anything has changed, other than at least there's some kind of exit strategy, and at least there's an exit date for coalition forces to be less involved on the ground in Afghanistan. I haven't seen senior military commanders actually proffering their resignations and actually going public to say that we failed our soldiers on the ground. I've yet to see, other than what the British people did at the general election, any of Tony Blair, Gordon Brown or anybody else involved from a senior political viewpoint here actually standing up and say, I made a horrendous mistake in not resourcing this campaign properly. Your book absolutely tells it the way it was on the ground, but I've seen nothing happen outside of the military command and the political thing to say we should never, ever let this happen to our British forces anywhere in the world.
Well, no, I mean, I think certainly, senior military officers and politicians, they always want to blame other people. And there's a lot of sort of buck passing going on. I think within the army, there has been some recognition that certain things were not done as well as they could have been, to put it mildly, and I hope that some lessons have been learned. In terms of the actual situation on the ground, I think it has improved somewhat, not least because of the arrival of 20,000 US Marines in Helmand. I think there are more, some of the procurement issues in terms of counter ID equipment and numbers of helicopters have also been improved. And Operation Panther's Claw was the last big solely British operation to clear ground in Helmand, because there was this sort of cycle almost. You had these 6-month tours of the whole brigade changing every 6 months, and every brigade wanting to do one big dramatic operation which grabbed lots of headlines and cleared lots of ground, and there were lots of headlines about the number of Taliban they killed. And then, of course, there weren't enough troops to hold that ground, and the Taliban came creeping in behind. I think that cycle kind of ended once the Americans arrived and after the Welsh Guards battle group had left. So I think on the ground, you can sort of see it in terms of casualty numbers on the British side, that they are lower, because I think finally the sort of force density ratio, to use the military jargon term, has been got right. And, the area that the Welsh Guards were in, for instance, has, with one battle group, now has 3 battle groups in it. So the sort of this thing of always trying to do more with less, I think, is no longer happening. So to that extent, some things have changed and some lessons have been learned.
This program is brought to you by ShadowFusionBooks.com.
We got your 6 and there's nothing you can do about it.
But I guess the impression that nothing politically's changed, though. I mean, the fact that neither Gordon Brown or Tony Blair have, deigned to surface and say, hang on a minute, the loss of British soldiers in Afghanistan is an absolute tragedy. I guess that's, because of a lot of what we do on politics and patriotism is sort of try and get people to think and challenge. It's good that the military have thought and been challenged. And I guess that's probably something you always see in the military because they're constantly evolving. To me, it's extremely disappointing that there seems to be no change in the cavalier complacency of political leaders, and particularly I'll be quite scathing and say, Gordon Brown, who ultimately controlled the money for the war, I still firmly believe today that he didn't want to go to war, so he basically didn't financially resource military operations for the British. And I have to be brutal and think I wonder how that man sleeps at night.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly there were very senior officers. General Richard Dannett was quoted in the book, and General Lord Guthrie basically saying that Gordon Brown never, as Chancellor, never seemed to show any real interest in the military apart from the naval base in his constituency in Dunfermline South or whatever it is. And of course, ironically, he sort of reaped what he'd sown earlier on by, who knows, partly out of maybe rivalry with Tony Blair, partly out of just the belief that that he didn't believe in the mission, and maybe partly out of just a sort of lack of understanding or failure to want to understand the military. That they were starved of funding, and there was an element of sort of hollowing out at the same time as sort of Tony Blair sort of over promising and over committing, and then of course by the time Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, a lot of these, I'm kind of using different metaphors here, chickens were coming home to roost. And again, culminated really with Rupert Thornlow's death. I mean, he was just, he was another casualty. He was a man like anybody else, and one human being out of many who've been killed. But the political impact of that, he'd previously been the military assistant to Des Brown, the Defence Secretary in the MOD. Gordon Brown knew him a little bit, or certainly knew him to sort of grunt to. And so it's sort of the first time really in Whitehall that somebody that they personally knew had been killed. And obviously he was the most senior officer to be killed since Colonel H. Jones in 1982. So a real huge impact. And David Cameron sort of really laid into Gordon Brown in Prime Minister's Question Time in July 2009. And that was after one of his advisors had received a briefing from a Welsh Guards officer who'd spoken to Rupert Thornlow just before his death. So yes, I mean politically, Gordon Brown had to face the music, and I think rightly so.
And I guess at some stage, I did read somewhere that the Welsh Guards will be back in Afghanistan.
They're due to go back in April. Yeah, April 2012.
And is that something you're planning to follow and maybe put a sequel out, maybe talking about their experiences and maybe contrasting how things have changed since the original book?
It's possible. It's possible. I guess I might go out. I don't plan to write any sequel. I mean, one of the things listeners might have sort of have picked up is I had a tremendous amount of difficulty getting this book successfully published because the MOD had to go through an MOD review process, which was extremely taxing and long running, with hundreds of queries and sort of complaints and arguments. And then at the end of all that, the MOD decided they still weren't happy, and there was a big sort of legal fight. And in the end, they bought all 24,000 copies of the first print run and destroyed them. And we made a few changes, I think a total of about 50 words, and we reprinted the book, and it was published sort of 2 weeks late. So after that experience, I think I'm not Mr. Popular within the MOD. The MOD controls access to all units, and I certainly haven't got much appetite to go through what I went through last time in terms of getting, what I thought was a sort of true and accurate book out. And I think I always felt as well that it was a sort of a one-shot exercise. There was going to be one book. And I know, but like Patrick Bishop, for instance, did 3 para, and then he did Ground Truth. But I think, I guess this is a very roundabout way of saying I think there probably will not be a sequel of the Welsh Guards returning to Afghanistan. But, we'll see.
We'll see, and and certainly I think anybody who has a conscious and decent soul, whether they agree with the reasons why we're in Afghanistan and the reasons we went to Iraq, that should always be divorced from absolute full support for those people who are on the ground, being prepared to put their lives on the line so that we can enjoy the freedoms that you and I have, so that we can have this discussion and you can also produce the book.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm, absolutely, filled with admiration and respect for all the soldiers and Marines and everybody else who serves in Afghanistan, in the UK and US forces. And it was, it's a real privilege to spend so much time with these men, mainly men, both out there and afterwards. And I mean, the book, obviously, with I think any good book, hopefully this is a good book, it operates on a number of levels, and there's a sort of political level, and then there's a sort of strategic level and a tactical level, and then there's a sort of a real sort of kind of ground level description and sort of examination of just what it's like to be out there, which operates independently of, certainly, as you say, whatever you think politically about the war. And there are, it's a harrowing read. There's it also deals with the knock on the door and the home front, and what was going on in Britain. And it deals with certainly with deaths and the injuries, but also and a few instances of cowardice and battle shock and things not going right. But I think sort of towering above all that in a way is the individual acts of heroism and incredible bravery, and sometimes things that you don't really hear about. I mean, for instance, I'll just give you one sort of example of something that probably happens, most days. In Helmand, even now, there was a guardsman who'd just seen one of his friends being blown to pieces and had to carry on barmering, this sweeping for IEDs, and he started slowing down, and he was going into shock, basically battle shock, and he couldn't really function. And there was another guardsman who was manning a weapon on top of the vehicle, who just said to his platoon commander, "Sir, Guardsman so-and-so, do you want me to take his place?" And so he jumped down from that vehicle, relatively safe position on that vehicle, onto that ground where he knew there were IEDs, low metal content IEDs. He'd just seen a fellow guardsman killed, blown to pieces, and he took that metal detector and carried on looking for IEDs down that road. And to me, that's something you very, very rarely hear about. He won't get any medals for that. But, an incredibly selfless and brave thing to do. And that happens all the time.
And certainly that's the impression I've got from reading your book and many other books written by not only people who have the depth and knowledge such as yourselves, but also some of the soldiers on the ground, is that there is a lot of things that we just don't hear about. And, people who I've recently read a book about some of the heroes who've been given medals. And one of the themes that came out of all of that one was that everybody who had been, given a military cross or whatever, all of them turned round and said, I shouldn't be getting this award. There are other people who have done much more heroic things. And if I have this award, it is testament to the soldiers in my platoon who I command, who were around me on the day. It's less about just one man getting a medal. I mean, talk about Trooper Bahari, such that, he would turn around and say he didn't do anything out of the ordinary. One of the, I think the only living recipient of the Victoria Cross, he would just turn and say, I was doing the job that I'd love to do. But I guess these people are always seen as figureheads. And I think it's fair to say that every soldier who goes out and fights for his country should deserve a medal.
Yeah, and of course they all do get the Afghanistan campaign medal. And it was said to them out there. I mean, the issue of medals is nothing more contentious, really, within the army. And I mean, these days, and certainly the British tradition is being pretty stingy with them compared to the Americans. And the Americans, you see General Petraeus with dozens and dozens of ribbons on his chest. But Charlie Anselm, the commanding officer after Rupert Thornlow, I remember him saying, that, when you've got your grandchildren, sort of playing at your feet in years to come, the thing that matters is that you were here in Helmand and you've got this. The only medal that really matters is this campaign medal. And I think that's absolutely right because, unfortunately, I think often medals are given almost ex officio. So, every brigadier who commands a brigade in Helmand gets either a DSO or a CBE. I mean, and I think certainly the first 8 of them did. And if you're a company commander, you've got a very, very high chance of getting a military cross. If you're a battle group commander, you'll get a DSO or an OBE. And a lot of the, guys lower down who are tremendously brave get a mention in dispatches or a commendation or nothing. And, there's always sort of jealousy and arguments about that. And so I do think it's a very good way of looking at it is the medal matters, is the campaign medal, and being there is what mattered. And also, I think another thing that was said to me afterwards is looking in the mirror in the morning and knowing what you did and being able to sort of look yourself in the eye, if you like, and know that you were out there and you did your job and you looked out for your fellow soldier is something that will live with you for the rest of your life. And I know that a lot of the many people who served in Helmand, have been through something that very few people can understand. I hope Dead Men Risen helps the general public understand a little bit more, but it's something that will be with them for good or for ill for the rest of their lives.
You are listening to another Politics and Patriotism podcast. Find us online through iTunes.
And as we start to wrap up, just to get your view, I mean, one of the things that I have mixed feelings on. I'm incredibly proud that people support Help for Heroes, but there's another side of me that's incredibly sad that our governments do not give our returning heroes the full support they need, and the fact that there has to be charities like the Royal British Legion, Help for Heroes, and countless other military charities. To me, it's a very damning indictment of the political way that we think of our soldiers, that we don't care enough for them to say if a soldier needs £1 million so that he can, have a decent life when he comes back from operations, maybe minus parts of his body, that he has to go to a charity to do that. I didn't know whether, just as we wrap, was what's the sort of feeling from the Welsh Guards and other combat soldiers you've spoken to who've come back from Afghanistan? Have they expressed an opinion on that?
Well, so, I mean, certainly Help for Heroes is somewhat controversial. And there's a bit in the book where Major Rob Gallimore, who was one of the Welsh Guards commanding officers, and I remember having a few gin and tonics with him in the Cavalry and Guards Club in Piccadilly, and he was going, bloody help. Well, it wasn't bloody, but Help for Heroes, being represented by a effing teddy bear. I don't want your pity. If you I signed up to do it. If you want to buy me a beer, then that's fine, but I don't want your pity. So there is that feeling about the way some of the charities have been sort of set up, and also the way that sometimes politicians and some people in the public and the media look at the troops. I mean, they are all volunteers, and they're tremendously proud of what they do, and mostly, even sometimes ones who have terrible things happen to them, are glad they were there because it's what they trained to do, and tremendously exhilarating and exciting and sort of meaningful at the sort of lower level. What I mean is it might not be politically particularly meaningful, because that's not what an ordinary guardsman thinks about. He just thinks about his regiment and the people who are beside him. So I think there's sometimes, with Wharton Bassett and all the rest of this sort of maudlin, the poor soldiers, and we feel so sorry for them. And I think that is something that the troops, by and large, push against and say, no, we want to be here. This is what we signed up for. And yes, we do want your support, but we don't want your pity.
I certainly get the sense of that from the book. So where can people purchase the book?
All good bookshops, hopefully, and hopefully all bad ones as well. Go to my website. If you want to find out more about it, go to my website, www.tobyharnden, HARNDEN.com. It's available at Amazon.com, .co.uk. So it's available on ebook in the US. Hasn't got a publisher in the US yet, although I'm working on that. The paperback comes out towards the end of October. So, it shouldn't be hard to get hold of. And naturally, I thoroughly recommend it.
And I will absolutely, I know I would always expect you to do that, but I'm quite happy to say, that, anybody who has an interest in not only what militaries are doing, but also in the way that they're supported by senior commanders and their government, should get Dead Men Risen, the Welsh Guards, and the real story of Britain's war in Afghanistan, because I think, as you've said and I've said, it shows the nitty-gritty. It shows, I'm not sure I'd actually want to experience what you actually talk about in the book, but it also comes up that higher level. So I want to thank. We will certainly make sure that there are links to your website when we put the show up on the politicsandpatriotism.com website. But I want to thank you very much for coming on the show. I read your book and I worked with Justin. I wanted to talk to you because I was really impressed with the book, and I think to me, it's made me think about what we should be doing in future conflicts and the way that we should force our political leaders to support our soldiers. So I want to thank you very much and appreciate the time.
Well, thank you, Martin. You clearly have read it, and very carefully, and I really appreciate that. And I'm glad you found it so rewarding, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about it.
And that does bring us to the end of a very fast 40 minutes. I'd like to say a special thanks to Martin Bain for hosting the program today, and I would like to extend a special gratitude to UK Telegraph editor Toby Harnden for sharing some of his time with us while discussing this book about the Welsh Guards and the very tough lessons of war that were learned by British leaders in Afghanistan. Ladies and gentlemen, if you like what you heard here today, you can find us online at www.politicsandpatriotism.com. We have lots of free stuff there for you on the website. You can subscribe to the RSS feed and download all of our past programs for free, Or you can go to the iTunes store and download all of our past shows for free. Or, for those of you mobile types out there, you can go to Stitcher.com, and thanks to the very nice people at Stitcher Smart Radio Network, you can download one of several apps. They've got something for your Apple OS. They've got something for your Android device. And they've even got a free app for your smartphone, so you can take us with you wherever you'd like to go on this green earth. So, on behalf of everyone here at the show, thank you for your time and have a very good day. Support your troops.
One world.